In the previous screencast, we were talking about Baroque Spain, governed by King Philip IV, who we see reflected in the mirror behind Velázquez's Las Meninas. Flanders, the Low Countries, had also come to be controlled by Philip IV in Spain. This goes back to around 1500 when the forefathers of Philip IV, the distant heirs of Philip the Good, had married into the Habsburg line. And from that point forward, the Spanish kings in Madrid ruled the Low Countries, usually through delegates rather than directly. And this led to certain social problems, particularly at the end of the 16th century. In 1566, we see that parts of the Low Countries converted to Protestantism, and this led to a huge outbreak in iconoclasm, the destruction of images. And we see here a print of some of the iconoclasm that broke out in 1566. At that point, the King of Spain was Philip II, the grandfather of Philip IV, and he was ardently Catholic. He dispatched troops to stop the iconoclastic uprisings in the Low Countries. This was called the Spanish Fury, that really basically went on a rampage through the Low Countries, killing Protestants. This then led to what is now known as the 80 Years' War. Broke out in 1568, lasted all the way until 1648, where the Protestants had all fled northward to Holland, Catholics staying behind in what is today Belgium, what was then known as the Spanish Netherlands or Flanders. And these two regions remained at war through the first half of the 17th century. The most prominent artist in Baroque Flanders is Peter Paul Rubens, one of really the great artists of all time, certainly one of the best known artists of all times. He was active in the city of Antwerp, which was the wealthiest city in the Spanish Netherlands, in Baroque-era Flanders. And we had already talked about Antwerp, in fact, when we were looking at art from the 16th century. Remember that artists are almost always active in the cities that are the most wealthy, and that's certainly the case for Rubens. He had gone to Italy to travel to see the great art of the Renaissance in 1600 and stayed there for 9 years. This was during Caravaggio's lifetime, when Rubens was actually there, but they probably never met. The interesting thing about Rubens in Italy at the time of Caravaggio is that he's one of the few artists who does not adopt Caravaggio's style. In fact, he goes in an entirely different direction, much more flamboyant, much brighter in tonality. The only thing that he shares with Caravaggio, other than coming from the same time period, is an interest in drama, and that is really everywhere in Baroque art. So here we see a work by Rubens painted while he was in Italy, showing the son of Apollo, Phaeton, who steals dad's car, so to speak, takes Apollo's chariot, which drives the sun across the sky, and tries to pilot it, and in so doing, he wrecks the chariot. Sort of, I guess, a lesson for all those teenagers out there wanting to borrow dad's car. Here we see Phaeton falling out of the chariot, the horses roaring off in different directions, and you can see that Rubens is very much interested in a heightened sense of drama, even though, of course, this is not a religious scene, not a Christian religious scene, but rather an ancient mythology, which was seen to be the most important kind of painting. This is exactly what Rubens is doing. What kept him from picking up Caravaggio? Well, a couple of different things. First and foremost, he seems to have been very much interested in Leonardo. Leonardo had worked on a fresco in the town hall in in Florence, and Rubens had seen it, made sketches after it. It's since been lost, probably painted over by another artist, but the rearing horses flailing through Rubens' sky come directly out of his study of of Leonardo. He seems to have also been very much interested in Michelangelo. We see this in all of the hyper-muscular body types. And then the color comes from a great interest that Rubens had in particularly Titian, but Venetian painters in general. Uh, and here we see a Titian that we haven't looked at before, a ceiling painting that's down at the National Gallery, originally designed to go on the roof and on the ceiling of a building. And Rubens, you can see, borrows, I think, Titian's color, his sense of drama and action, and really heightens all of this for his work. In 1609, Rubens came back to Antwerp, where which would make his base for the rest of his career. The reason he came back, you probably remember from your worksheet, is that his mother was dying. And on arriving back in Antwerp, he gets a major commission, actually a pair of them, for huge altar pieces. Christ in this image is more than twice life size. All of the figures more than twice life size. And we can see the same application of Baroque drama in Rubens's hands to religious scenes as well as to mythological scenes. What makes it particularly Baroque, it's still very clear. It's very realistic and accurate. It's incredibly dramatic. He doesn't show us a simple crucifixion scene, but he shows us the actual raising of the cross where the men, these hyper-muscular men, struggle and pull at the cross to lift it up into its post hole. It's an active, action-filled moment. Christ looks towards heaven as he's raised up. These muscular men, I think, intended to support the idea that Christ is bearing the weight of the world, and you need someone as athletic as that to raise the cross. In the right-hand panel of this huge triptych, we see some of the Roman soldiers directing the action, and we see the two thieves that will be crucified with Christ behind them, the horse looking directly out to us. Again, that Baroque sense of engagement. You can almost hear this picture as well. Left-hand panel, the Virgin Mary with John, the evangelist, in the dark there, very pale as if she's about to faint. The women of Jerusalem with their children, which we read about in the Bible when Christ is making his way toward Calvary, in the lower left corner. Everything hyper dramatic across all three. Let's look at some details, particularly of the center panel, where we can see one of the things that he's interested in are these muscles as they lift the cross. They're twist and turn into a series of complex poses that are never really impossible to read, but with figures that have even more musculature than Michelangelo had. As a Baroque picture, you can almost imagine all of your senses coming into play. The sound of the wind in the trees, the spaniel in the lower left corner, barking and snarling, again adding to that sense of sound and smell. All of that touch and sweat, all of your different senses are brought together by Rubens into a sense of amazing drama. We talked about the fact that Caravaggio seems to have nailed the principles of the Counter-Reformation, but I think that there's almost no painter who's more Baroque when we think about what Baroque art has been all about. There's no painter that's more Baroque than Rubens. Absolutely, because I think he adds, this the emotional quality of color to the works. He's found a different solution than Caravaggio, and one that is equally effective. Now, one of the interesting things about Rubens is that he practiced the spiritual exercises that were laid down by Saint Ignatius Loyola. Loyola had written that the devout should attempt to imagine themselves engaged physically with the scenes, sort of encouraged visionary experience where, as you read the text, for example, this one of the raising of the cross, as a devout Christian, you should imagine the sounds, the smells, the touches, the tastes of these things, the sweat dripping from Christ, the blood, the dirt under your feet. And this was a weeks-long set of exercises that Loyola had laid out, and Rubens was known to practice these. And as such, his works tend to have that ability to reach out to everything that you have, all five of your senses at once. Bernini was also an ardent follower of the writings of Ignatius Loyola, and he too practiced the spiritual exercises, and it shows up in his work as well. In this particular image, it's fascinating because one of the figures that's helping to raise the cross is Saint Longinus. And Saint Longinus was the centurion who pierced Christ's side. And here he's helping to raise the cross. And according to legend, he was cured when, I think we talked about this in class, with the Master of St. Veronica's crucifixion. By legend, he was cured when Christ's blood ran down the lance and he wiped his eyes. And he could miraculously see and understood what he had done. Well, here St. Longinus stares sort of blankly toward Christ. At this point in the story, he would have still been blind. But what's interesting is that his features are a self-portrait of Rubens. So here Rubens is incorporating himself into the image in the same way that Ignatius Loyola said that he should, that he is imagining himself there. And in a way, even though he's helping to crucify Christ, that's a strong theological message, because we all helped crucify Christ. If you approach it from a Christian standpoint, the whole reason he was crucified is because of our sins. So we all helped raise that cross in one way or another. And Rubens totally understands this and includes himself in the image as St. Longinus. Rubens's ability to place himself in the scene is also apparent in this massive picture, one of the largest pictures in all of the National Gallery, Daniel in the Lion's Den, another religious picture. And he very much applies this sense of high drama and emotionalism, and also the engaging way with which we are included in the scene in this particular image. The story is, if you don't know it, Daniel was at the court of the Persian king in the Old Testament and was a worshiper of the Hebrew God, and the Persian king condemned Daniel for worshiping the God of the Old Testament instead of worshiping the Persian king. And so the condemnation, the penalty, was that he would be thrown into a pit with starving lions who would immediately eat him alive. And this was apparently a common condemnation, because you'll see the bones and the skulls of the other people who have been eaten straight around the feet of Daniel. However, according to the story, Daniel's faith, his prayers, tamed the lions and preserved him. And so here we see the dramatic moment when the stone is rolled away and Daniel is revealed to still be alive 3 days after having been thrown into the pit. The story was often used by Christian theologians as a symbol for Christ, sort of a prototype, if you will, for Christ, because just as Christ was put into the tomb for 3 days and rose again, so Daniel was thrown into the lion's den for 3 days and was then released. Rubens gives us a very credible series of lions, and we can see lower left corner, for example, the ones that have been calmed by Daniel's prayers, or by God himself, if you will. But we're also put right in the midst of danger. We see two angry lions in the lower right corner to remind us of exactly the sort of danger that Daniel is in. But again, we are right there. We're right in the middle of the action. And here in this case, as Daniel looks towards heaven, one of the lions seems to be sizing us up. Can't eat Daniel because of Daniel's prayers, but you and I are fair game. And the one directly behind him baring his teeth, so we know just how horrifying this would be. Again, all of these lions are illustrated. This is a huge canvas. It's over 10 feet across. And interestingly, Rubens made it on spec. He just made it for himself, kept it around his house. In fact, we know a few years later, 1619 or so, he offers it in trade to a collector from London. He had been to London, traveled there, met a collector who wanted one of his works, and he trades it for a bunch of Roman statues and coins and cameos for his own collection back in Antwerp. And at that point, he offers him this picture and says, I painted every part of it myself. No assistance helped me on this one. So we know he still owned it at that point. He made it on spec. The lions are fantastic. They're really, really well drawn. And Rubens seems to have drawn them from life in the Royal Zoo in Brussels. And the reason he had access to the Royal Zoo is that Rubens had begun a second career as a diplomat. He spoke 5 different languages. He was incredibly well read, very learned, apparently charming as all get out. And he had gotten a job as a court artist and diplomat, of all things, for the local governor who is sort of overseeing the Spanish Netherlands for the Spanish king, Archduke Albert and Archduchess Isabella of Austria, relatives to Philip IV in Spain, and his local designees to govern the Low Countries. And Rubens becomes their court emissary. And from this point, he travels throughout all of Europe as a diplomat, not as an artist, but still. He ends up going to London, he ends up going to Spain, he ends up going to Italy again. He ends up going everywhere on behalf of Albert and Isabella. And in fact, if we go back to Las Meninas, Rubens actually traveled to Spain and met Velázquez, turned Velázquez on to Titian. They wandered through the royal collection together. And when we talked about Las Meninas, we talked about those paintings on the wall behind him, those allegories for artistic talent. Those are paintings by Rubens that Velázquez chose to keep in his studio with him to inspire him. So Rubens was really very much everywhere. And we're very fortunate to have this, one of his great overscaled, oversized works here in the National Gallery. Indeed, this picture on the left in the Louvre was one of the works he painted while on diplomatic mission. He was sent to France by Isabella and Albert on behalf of the Spanish king, Philip IV. And while there, he's commissioned by the Queen of France, Marie de Medici, of our old friends, the Medici family, commissioned by her to paint a series of 20 pictures illustrating the glories of her life. Now, a little story on Marie de Medici, just some background. She's the mother of Philip IV's second or first wife, the one before the one in the mirror in Las Meninas. So she has connections to the Habsburg court, right? Her daughter is married to the Habsburg king of Spain. And it's important to remember how much this intermarriage was a key component of diplomacy. The daughters and sons being wed off to other royal families in order to ensure diplomatic alliances. These marriages were rarely because of love. So Marie de Medici was actually betrothed to the King of France, Henry IV, as an arranged marriage. Here her portrait is presented to Henry by Roman gods up above in heaven, suggesting that this is a marriage made in heaven. It's anything but. It's an arranged marriage for power. And here Henry's looking at her picture, deciding if this is indeed the one he wants to marry. Now, this whole series of paintings, these 20 pictures by Rubens of the glories of Marie de' Medici's life, were important for Marie de' Medici because shortly after they were married, Henry was assassinated in 1610. And at that point, his son, Louis XIII, was only 9 years old. So he could not take over the reins of power in France. And Marie de' Medici took over as regent until Louis XIII became old enough to become king. This didn't really sit well with the French people. She was Italian, and the French didn't like that. And in fact, they even thought that she might have helped to get Henry assassinated so that she could grab power. So she commissions this series of paintings from Rubens to build up her reputation, to show how great she really was, and to sort of, remove any doubt that she had anything to do with the death of Henry IV. And so in our picture, the one on the left that we started with, she's actually arriving from Italy to France, and she's being welcomed there. The problem is Henry wasn't there when she arrived. This is how much of an arranged marriage it was. And so Rubens has got his work cut out for him. He's got to figure out how to make Marie de' Medici into something special when, in fact, the circumstances of their marriage was anything but special, anything but glorious. So how does he do this? This is where it gets really kind of fascinating. He pulls out all the stops. He has the ocean personified by a series of figures. Neptune himself as the bearded old man here. He's the one in the background with the trident, is steering the ship, pushing it forward. So he's the one that we see sort of from the back behind the bearded man. And then we have other figures as the turbulent seas being now calmed in a way as the boat is steered through this. Marie de' Medici in the white robe descends the gangplank with the rest of her retinue, and the boat itself is steered by a member of the Knights of Malta. This group, we can identify him by the Maltese cross on his chest. The Knights of Malta were responsible for taking care of the holy sepulchre of Christ's grave. And here he again serves as a guardian figure of something precious, in this case, Marie de' Medici. As she disembarks in France, where again Henry did not meet her, we see up above a personification of fame, trumpeting her arrival, and then we see welcoming her a personification of France itself. As a Roman warrior wearing the French fleur-de-lis, the gold lily flower against the blue background, actually bowing down to welcome her. And the figure behind has been identified as a personification of the city of Marseille, where she landed. So Rubens takes this, and it's a very, again, dramatic, engaging, emotional scene, where in fact the original arrival was really something that wasn't special in any particular way. This is just one of 20 plus different images that were part of the Marie de' Medici cycle, and you can see them all together now in the Louvre. Rubens ran a huge shop in Antwerp, had assistants working on his many compositions. Rubens would make the entire composition, and many of his assistants would then carry out the individual bits under his control, and then he would finish it, add the final layer. Anthony van Dyck was the most famous of these assistants that he employed in Antwerp. He was really, Rubens was really the sort of the game there. Everyone worked around his orbit. Van Dyck was a child prodigy. He was already painting by time he was 14 years old. In fact, here's a self-portrait from that time period when he's around 14. which means if you do the math, you can figure out that he painted our portrait of Isabella Brandt at the National Gallery when he was only 20 or 21 years old, which is pretty incredible. It's a portrait of Rubens's first wife. Van Dyck and Rubens were, in fact, close friends. And Van Dyck depicts her in the garden of the house that Rubens had designed and built right in the center of Antwerp. That garden still survives, and you can see the gate that Rubens designed behind Isabella Brandt off to her left. Van Dyck painted this picture as a gift for Rubens. He painted it actually as a parting gift. Van Dyck was about to begin to travel outside of the Low Countries, looking for some place where he could form an independent career outside of the shadow of Rubens. He kept returning, however, to Antwerp, Van Dyck did, his hometown. But this work was painted for Rubens just before Van Dyck began his travels, looking for a base where he could pursue his own career. From Rubens, Van Dyck learned this high Baroque mode of drama and action and color, vibrancy. This massive picture in Baltimore at the Museum of Art in Baltimore, almost 8 feet tall, over 7 feet wide, certainly shows him, I think, in many ways trying to do Rubens as good as Rubens could do it. The painting is a history painting. It's a Renaissance story written in the 1580s about the Middle Ages. The subject taking place in the 11th century, even though the actual story was written in the 15th century. It's a story about the First Crusade, where the Muslims in Jerusalem sent Armida, a sorceress, to the Crusader camp. And the whole point was that she would put a spell on the most valiant Crusader, Rinaldo. And so that's what we see happening, is Armida coming in to cast this spell on Rinaldo to put him to sleep so she can kill him. But what happened in the story is that she looked down on him, and this valiant Christian Crusader was so beautiful that she immediately fell in love with him and took him captive and held him in an enchanted garden instead. And so that's the moment that we see here, is her falling in love with her prey, if you will. She eventually converts to Christianity and lets him go. That's how the story plays out. But here, as she puts the wreath around his neck, you can see that her face is very brightly lit and finely resolved, whereas his face is in shadow and more softly painted to show the spell that he's under. Now, this picture was also made as a gift, just as the portrait of Rubens' wife was. This picture was painted by Van Dyck on spec, and was then sent by emissary to the King of England, King Charles I of England, as a gift to show off Van Dyck's talents, to show King Charles what a good painter he was, with the hopes that Charles would then hire him to work at the court. This is again part of Van Dyck's attempt to get out from under the shadow of Rubens, his good friend, but who also totally dominated the scene, the artistic scene in Antwerp. Right? In order to prove his talents, he makes the most dramatic and large picture he can, where you can see that Armida comes flying in, her red robe trailing in the wind. It's hyper Baroque, all of these diagonals coming in, sort of meeting at the place where she leans over Rinaldo. The figures that appear, for example, the sea nymph in the lower right corner, presenting the paper, seems to borrow very much directly from Van Dyck's teacher, mentor, friend, Rubens, as if he's trying to out-Rubens Rubens. And the overall composition seems to owe something to a fairly prominent Titian work, showing Bacchus and Ariadne, which was really quite well known internationally, that Titian had painted for the Este, who we talked about before, as part of this series of paintings that went with Bellini's Feast of the Gods. But again, the figure kind of sweeping in with this bolt of fabric behind them, and the overall compositional layout owing a lot to Titian. All of this was meant to make Charles want to hire Van Dyck, to show him really what he could do. And it worked. King Charles I immediately hired Anthony Van Dyck to be his primary court portrait painter. Rubens's job for King Charles I was to paint not only Charles himself, but all the members of his court. And so in the National Gallery, we have a larger than life-size portrait of Charles's wife, Queen Henrietta Maria, with her court attendant, the dwarf Geoffrey Hudson. We've seen quite a few dwarfs at court in the Baroque period, and England was no different. Now, Charles's wife, Henrietta Maria, was actually the French daughter of Marie de Medici and King Henry IV of France, which makes her the granddaughter of the Queen of Spain. And again, we can see the degree to which all of these royal families are intertwined, intermarried. Now, Henrietta Maria, on coming to marry Charles I, again, as an arranged marriage for diplomacy and power, she spoke almost no English whatsoever, which made her feel somewhat alienated at court. Van Dyck, however, coming from the Spanish Netherlands, spoke many languages, including French. And they became incredibly good friends. He painted her over 25 different times. This is one of the more famous portraits of her where, again, this is larger than life size. He focuses on the spectacle of the robe. And again, the colors in this are so vibrant. That wonderful yellow on the right, the red of Sir Geoffrey Hudson, and her amazing blue satin robe, really making a wonderful pairing of different colors that he learned, I think, from looking at Titian's and from also, of course, studying under Rubens. Behind her shoulder is a potted orange tree. She is reputed to have introduced oranges into England. But at the same time, we can also see the potted orange tree as being a symbol for her, someone transplanted from a warmer climate, if you will, from another country, brought as her potted plant herself into the court of Charles I. Hudson is a 14-year-old dwarf. Again, this was very, very common at court. We saw them in Las Meninas by Velázquez, here with his pet monkey on his shoulder. They weren't very enlightened when it came to social progress, our court members in the 17th century. And the idea of keeping a dwarf around for entertainment is really kind of revolting when you think about it. You'll notice that her crown is off to the right and almost hidden gold on gold against this bolt of fabric that it sits on. She's nicely dressed, but she's shown as a cultured aristocrat rather than as a queen. In fact, if you look at her, there are no trappings of royalty whatsoever. Just a really beautiful dress, and she could be any sort of aristocratic lady. This is a fascinating thing about images of the court of Charles I, is that none of them show any signs of regency, or at least they tend not to. The Charles I on the hunt, dismounted on the hunt, shows Charles as a cultured gentleman rather than as a king. There's no crown, there's no scepter, there's no orb, all of the things that we tend to associate with royal portraiture. He's instead a gentleman out on the hunt with his groom holding his horse. And Queen Henrietta Maria is a lady of refinement on her porch with a close friend, a potted orange tree. This becomes a sort of fascinating issue because Charles and his political advisors believed very much in absolute monarchy, the idea that the king has power that should not be questioned by the people. But they also argued that this power of the absolute monarch was given to the king by agreement of the people because he deserved it. And what made him deserve to be king was his superior culture and his superior character, rather than his birthright, was what made him qualified to be king. Part of a kind of social contract where the individuals of England have ceded their rights to the leaders because of the leaders' outstanding character. So when it comes to official portraits of either the king or the queen, it's not important that they have the crown. It's important instead that they are cultured individuals who fully deserve the rank that they have been given. It's not the crown that makes them royal. What makes them royal is their culture.